There is a recurring phrase in the forgotten archives of Hollowridge County, written in the margin of an 1881 police report. No one dared climb to the room of repentance after sunset. It is from this brief, almost timid note that the entire story of the Ashenford Sisters begins, or perhaps ends. The year was 1881, and the village of Ashenford Hollow, lost among damp woods and low hills, still seemed stuck at the beginning of the century, indifferent to the progress that was already advancing in other parts of the country. It was a community of dirt floors, small windows and narrow roads that turned to thick mud at the slightest threat of rain. Entire families lived off growing corn, raising lean cattle, and trading at small weekly fairs. The world moved slowly there, and time seemed like the cold dampness that permeated their clothes, heavy, slow, resistant to change. It was in this setting that the Ashenford sisters, Helena and Miriam, emerged. The two were the daughters of a tailor and a teacher, both of whom had died before 1874. Alone, they inherited the family property, a house too big for two young women, built of dark wood with a silent attic that always seemed on the verge of collapsing under the weight of the years. The sisters were not exactly popular, but they were not feared either. They were discreet, reserved, the kind of presence that is only noticed when it disappears. Contemporary accounts describe Helena, the eldest, as firm, direct, with a gaze that rarely wavered. Miriam, 2 years younger, was remembered as someone with a soft voice, an uncertain expression, and a propensity for collecting small objects, buttons, ribbons, unused keys. Nothing about them would have attracted attention were it not for one specific room in the house, the old guest room, which had been closed for generations, and over time had been given the strange name that survives to this day in documents, the Room of Repentance. No one knows for sure who gave it that name. Some testimonies recorded decades later mention that it had been called that since the time of the Ashenford sisters' grandparents. Others claim that it was just a joke among young people in the community, like so many other stories created to scare each other during the long winter nights. The fact is, however, that the term appears repeatedly in official local police reports, which turns the legend into an unsettling curiosity. The sisters' property was located in the upper part of Ashenford Hollow, in an area where the wind seemed to make more noise than in other parts of the village. The road leading there was narrow and lined with trees that in the fall left the path covered with leaves that crunched underfoot. Those who passed by at dusk always reported the same feeling, that the environment was too quiet, as if even the birds had stopped singing, a subtle but persistent strangeness. The residents respected the sisters, albeit from a distance. They sought out Helena for small clothing repairs and turned to Miriam when they needed help with letters, documents, or reading news from outside. Nothing about them suggested any connection to mystery or violence. On the contrary, they were described as hard-working, discreet and disciplined young women. However, at some point something changed in the routine of the house. Records of correspondence show that, around March 1881, the visitors who used to stay at the property, travelers, seamstresses, distant relatives, stopped coming. For years, the Ashenfords had welcomed people passing through the region, offering a simple bed and breakfast in exchange for a few coins. But from the spring of that year onwards, no further records of lodging appear in the preserved account books. The change is sudden, silent, and coincides exactly with the period when the first reports of disappearances in the area begin. The missing were mostly men passing through Ashenford Hollow on their way to neighboring counties, lone travelers, itinerant workers, salesmen, people who often went unnoticed when they arrived, and no one noticed when they left. Under normal circumstances, no one would have connected one name to the other. But in the police files, one note stands out. Several of the missing were last seen near the road leading to the Ashenford sisters' house. Behind this apparent coincidence lies the most disturbing detail found among the old papers, an anonymous testimony with no exact date added to the file years later. They said that all you had to do was look out the right window at the wrong time to lose your way back. The note ends with a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. The room of repentance should not have been opened that night. It is this small record, hidden among pages yellowed by time, that casts the first shadow over the case. A shadow that, as we shall see, would grow larger as the year 1881 progressed. And this is where the mystery truly begins. Before the disappearance that would forever mark the Ashenford Sisters' name in the county records, life in Ashenford Hollow followed an almost ritualistic rhythm, shaped by nature and the slow pace of the 19th century. Residents rose early, before the sun even touched the tops of the hills, and walked the dirt roads with steps that kicked up the cold morning dust. It was a hard life, but a predictable one, and in a way, predictability was the glue that held the community together. The Ashenford Sisters fit into this routine like two silent pieces of a larger mechanism. Helena, always more practical, was seen carrying baskets, negotiating fabrics, measuring shoulders and sleeves with the precision of someone who had grown up in a tailor's shop. Her father, William Ashenford, had left her the patterns, the needle case, and the old cutting table. She used them every day with almost reverent devotion. Miriam, on the other hand, was the opposite of her sister, more serene, more contemplative. Some women in the village remembered finding her sitting by the river, reading old letters or examining small objects found by the roadside. She organized everything as if each detail carried a hidden meaning. A rusty key, a piece of blue ribbon, a coat button with an unknown symbol. In the eyes of others, it was just an eccentric hobby. But in her eyes, each small artifact seemed to be part of something bigger. Testimonies reconstructed decades later suggest that in the early months of 1881, the two sisters began to become even more reserved. They began to circulate less in the village, participate less in fairs, and decline invitations to community gatherings that they had previously considered important. No one could say why. Some believed they were mourning something they never mentioned. Others thought they were just reclusive, trying to protect the house after a series of storms damaged part of the roof. But there were signs, small and almost imperceptible, that something in the routine of the Ashenford property was no longer the same. One of the oldest accounts, found in a diary belonging to a resident named Edith Carpenter, reads, "I passed by the sisters' house at dusk. I saw the light of a lamp in the back room, but no shadows moved inside. Everything seemed too tidy, too quiet." Another account, this one from a traveling salesman, describes an even more specific scene. "I knocked on the door of the Ashenford house to offer my products. Helena appeared, but she spoke hurriedly, as if she wanted to end the conversation. In the background, I saw a door ajar in the hallway. It was unusual. I remember the chill I felt when I noticed that someone seemed to be watching through that crack. These records, when analyzed today, seem like omens, but at the time they were just isolated perceptions, scattered in personal diaries or mentioned casually in conversations at the market. Still, there was another change that many noticed. The old guest room, the so-called room of regret, seemed to be in use again. For years, no one had entered it. It was a room with a narrow window facing the woods, wood darkened by time, and a permanent smell of dust and old fabric. But from the end of the winter of 1881, some people reported seeing the window curtain move, as if someone were inside the room. When asked about it during one of her rare visits to the grocery store, Miriam replied with a curiously disconnected calm, "We're just reorganizing the space, that's all." But no one completely believed her. As life went on, small tensions began to build in the community. In April of that year, 3 men disappeared within a few weeks of each other. All were lone travelers. All were last seen a short distance from the road leading to the Ashenford Sisters' house. At the time, however, there was not enough reason to connect the two things. The region was vast, the trails were confusing, and for many, a man could simply have gone on his way without warning. But what really began to worry some residents were the more subtle changes, the ones that no one could clearly explain. Mrs. Whitlow, one of the oldest neighbors, reported in 1907, "One morning I heard footsteps on the road, very early, before sunrise. Hurried, heavy footsteps. Soon after I saw Helena walking to the well, but she seemed nervous. looking back all the time. It wasn't like her. Another account, this one from a boy who lived in the area, described what he saw when he climbed a small hill near the sister's house. The side door was open, and I saw Miriam holding a small box, as if she were keeping something. She saw me and closed the door very quickly. She didn't seem to want anyone to know. Small accounts, small shadows, nothing concrete, but enough that, looking back, we can see the gradual build-up of tension that no one at the time knew how to interpret. And then came the day when everything would change. In early summer 1881, a fourth disappearance was reported. This time it wasn't a traveler with no roots. It was a community acquaintance, Samuel Hargrove, a grocer's delivery man, a simple, kind man who regularly visited Ashenford Hollow. Samuel was last seen walking down the road, leading to the Ashenford Sisters' property carrying 2 boxes of supplies. He never made it home. His groceries were found days later near a fallen fence, as if they had been dropped in a hurry. And it was at this point, precisely at this point, that a detail in the archives changed the course of general perception. Samuel's record, unlike the others, had an additional note written by the sheriff himself at the time. Witnesses claimed to have heard a door slam loudly at the Ashenford Sisters' house shortly before the disappearance. This is where the community's silence begins to turn into unease, and for some, fear, because in the days following Samuel's disappearance, someone else claimed to have seen a shadow move inside the old guest room. Not a clear silhouette, not a face, just a brief shift in the light, as if a presence were there. And that was the last time the room of repentance was seen with the window partially open. Samuel Hargrove's disappearance changed the behavior of the village of Ashenford Hollow almost immediately. Until then, the community had treated disappearances as accidents or carelessness on the part of travelers. But Samuel was no stranger. He was someone known, someone everyone saw weekly, someone whose route was always the same and had never caused concern. When he disappeared, the previously restrained conversations began to spread like smoke through the dirt streets. The local sheriff, Thomas Merritt, decided to launch a more concrete investigation. He had known the Ashenford sisters since childhood, but unlike most, he had never been close to them. Still, he recorded a visit to the property shortly after Samuel's disappearance. In the official archives, there is an excerpt from his report that has survived the test of time. I arrived at the Ashenford residence around 6 in the afternoon. The wind was blowing hard, and the side door was closed but not locked. Miriam appeared first. She seemed calm, but her right hand was trembling slightly. I asked about Samuel. She said she hadn't seen anyone that morning. I asked to look around the property. Helena appeared and looked at me with unusual coldness. They didn't stop me, but they didn't help either. According to the document, this inspection found nothing unusual. However, in the last sentence of the record, the sheriff added something peculiar. There was a smell of damp fabric coming from the old guest room. Nothing else. And it was this seemingly irrelevant mention that, decades later, led researchers to return to the same room in search of new clues. But at that time, in 1881, it was just a discreet note, lost among so many others. The investigation continued for days, with no new leads. However, while the sheriff was busy examining trails and talking to neighbors, a silent and almost invisible event set in motion what would be the climax of that summer. On June 17, 1881, shortly before dusk, a woodcutter named Edwin Collins reported passing by the sisters' house while carrying tools back to the village. He described the scene in a statement recorded years later. The window in the back room was open, not all the way, just a crack, but enough to see the curtain move. And I swear I heard something like furniture being dragged inside, not loud but steady. I don't know if it was someone or just old woodworking, but I stopped for a moment and felt I shouldn't be there. Logically, there was no reason to be suspicious. Old houses make noises, curtains move with the wind. But at that time, everything surrounding the Ashenford property seemed to take on a different weight, perhaps because each disappearance added a new layer to the general unease. Perhaps because the sisters' silence was beginning to seem like a conscious choice, and not just modesty. 2 nights after the woodcutter's report, around 10 p.m., A group of residents heard sounds coming from the hill where the house stood. Muffled, rhythmic sounds like steady beats, followed by long intervals. They weren't screams. They weren't hurried footsteps. They were like sharp blows against wood. In statements collected in 1906, when the case was revisited, these knocks were described in various ways. It sounded like someone nailing something to the wall. It sounded like a door being pushed against the frame. It sounded like an attempt to open or close something large. But none of these accounts are conclusive. They are all subjective perceptions stored in memory. What is known for certain is that same week, 2 other men disappeared in the region. One of them, identified as Arthur Mullen, was last seen talking to Helena at the village market. He was carrying a small cloth bundle that Helena herself had given him, according to 2 witnesses. Arthur was never found. The second missing person was a traveler whom no one knew by name. It was only recorded that he stopped at the grocery store to ask for information about lodging. He was advised to continue on toward another village. But a young woman named Louise Hammond remembered seeing the man approach the road that led to the Ashenford property. He looked tired, hungry. Maybe he asked for water. Maybe he was just passing through. I don't know. All I know is that he never came back. These events, added to the noises heard in the house, created an atmosphere of tension so dense that the very air of the village seemed to change. Some families began to avoid the path that led to the property. Others began to lock their doors earlier. Children were forbidden to play near the hills. And as the community withdrew, the sisters became increasingly isolated. In the last documents preceding the height of the case, there are 3 particularly important records. The first is the testimony of a seamstress, Helena's colleague, who claimed to have seen her buy a large quantity of thick fabric, the kind used to reinforce furniture or cover antique objects. She asked what it was for, but Helena simply replied, "They're adjustments I need to make in the house. Nothing more." The second record comes from a farmer who was passing by on the road in the late afternoon and heard Miriam talking to someone inside the house. The curious thing is that according to him, the voice that responded was not Helena's, but he could not identify whether it was a man or a woman. They sounded like instructions, as if someone was asking for calm. I can't explain it. The third is the most disturbing, the report of an unexpected visit by Sheriff Merritt, recorded on June 29th. He returned to the house to ask further questions about the traveler's disappearance. Helena greeted him at the door. The conversation was brief, but one detail is noted at the end. As we spoke, I heard a muffled sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like something being dragged. Helena didn't turn to look. She just said, "The house is old. It makes noises when the weather changes." But the sky was clear that night. This excerpt became symbolic of all subsequent speculation, and then we come to the decisive night. The reconstruction of the facts indicates that, on the night of July 12, 1881, there was unusual movement on the property. A couple returning from church claimed to have seen a lamp lit in the room of repentance, something that, according to all previous reports, rarely happened. Shortly before midnight, the same couple reported hearing a door slam shut, a loud bang that echoed across the hill. They stopped on their way, trying to identify the source of the sound. The lamp was still lit. That was the last flash of light recorded in that room. The next day, at dawn, Sheriff Merritt returned to the property, this time accompanied by 2 residents. The house was strangely quiet. Helena did not appear when they called. Neither did Miriam. The side door was ajar. The sheriff entered slowly. In the hallway there were faint marks on the floor, like recent scratches. The wood was scratched, indicating that something heavy had been moved. The air inside the house was colder than normal, and not because of the weather outside, which was hot and humid that day. At the end of the hallway, the door to the old guest room, the room of regret, was open, just a crack. That's when the sheriff, slowly pushing that door open, wrote the sentence that would end the day's log. There was something in the center of the room, something that looked like it had been left in a hurry. And next to it, I saw the clear mark of a man's boot, still damp with dew. He does not describe the object at that moment. He just ends with, And it was at that moment that I knew the house was not empty. The files indicate that Sheriff Merritt stood motionless at the bedroom door for a few seconds, as if his own body refused to accept what his eyes were beginning to register. The note he makes next, years later, when he rewrites his statement for a review of the case, is almost an outburst. It wasn't a guest room, not anymore. It was a place prepared for someone to stay there for a long time. In the center of the room was a kind of makeshift bed, not an ordinary bed, like those that used to welcome weary travelers, but a low platform covered with a thin, yellowed mattress, with strips of thick fabric attached to the sides. The walls, lined with cloth in some places, appeared to have been recently reinforced. Near the window, a hook attached to the wood was used to hold the curtain so that, depending on how it was fastened, only a strip of light could enter. Next to the bed on the floor was the mark of the man's boot indicated in the report. A damp outline, still dark, as if someone had just been led there, or hastily removed. There was no blood. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. The terror that room produced did not come from a brutal scene, but from the sense of organization, of method, of intention. Merritt took a step back, called the two men who accompanied him, and asked them to search the rest of the house. The search lasted for hours. They opened cupboards, lifted loose floorboards, checked the attic and the basement. They found no one, none of the sisters, no travelers, no bodies. They did, however, find something else. In a wooden chest stored in the next room, personal items were piled up. Pocket watches, handkerchiefs embroidered with initials, small notebooks, pieces of letters never sent, foreign coins, a medallion engraved with the image of a woman and a child. Many of these items would later be associated with the names of some of the missing persons. The reports are clear on one point. None of this could be explained away as simple forgetfulness on the part of the guests. These were items that had been collected, stored, almost catalogued, and among them was a small notebook with a dark cover containing Miriam's careful handwriting on several pages. This notebook, now preserved with extreme care, is one of the few direct windows into the minds of the Ashenford Sisters. It is not a traditional diary, full of confessions or exact dates. Rather, it is a collection of loose phrases, fragmented reflections, notes that mix guilt, moral discipline, and rigid ideas about male behavior. On one of the pages we read, "Some men only stop to think when they are forced to be silent with themselves." On another, "Here they have time to look at what they have done. No one looks at them as victims. This is the room of repentance, not punishment." When these phrases first appeared in the investigation, they divided the community. For some, they were proof that the sisters kept men imprisoned in the house, convinced that they were imposing some kind of moral correction. For others, they were just delusions put on paper, exaggerated interpretations of a disturbed mind. But there was more. On a nearly torn sheet of paper, hastily annotated, Miriam had left a comment that decades later would be considered the emotional key to the case. He cried not for what they did to him, but for what he did to her. They had never let him be quiet long enough to hear that. There is no name, no date, no clear reference to who he or she were. But many scholars interpret this passage as an indication that the sisters selected certain men, perhaps those accused of violence, abuse, or abandonment, and subjected them to a period of confinement in that room, believing that they were somehow adjusting something that official justice would never touch. This theory, however, has never been proven conclusively. What is known from the testimonies is that, after the discovery of the room and the chest of personal belongings, the news spread quickly. In a few days, Ashenford Hollow went from being just a quiet village to a place marked by whispers, accusations, and suspicious glances. Some men, especially those who used to travel alone, began to avoid the region altogether. Women who had previously viewed the sisters with a certain curiosity now spoke of them with fear and revulsion. Some called them unbalanced vigilantes, while others saw them as the product of a time that was too harsh for women alone, trying to control what little they could in a world designed to ignore them. Under pressure, the authorities reopened all missing persons cases related to the area. They reconstructed routes, compared dates, and listened to aging witnesses. In some cases, the pieces seemed to fit together awkwardly. A man who had publicly argued with his wife before disappearing. Another known for intimidating young people in the neighborhood. A third, accused of unpaid debts and broken promises. None of these elements, taken alone, prove any intent, but taken together, they create a moral backdrop that, in a way, fueled the narrative that the Ashenford sisters did not act at random. Meanwhile, the search for the two continued, without success. Some said they had seen them leaving the area at dawn, walking along the secondary road that led beyond the hills. Others swore they were still hiding somewhere nearby, watching everything, waiting for the right moment to disappear for good. None of this has been proven. In September 1881, 2 months after the discovery of the room, a new search party was organized, this time including men from neighboring counties. They searched woods, dug near streams, and examined old ditches. They found bone fragments, yes, but the state of decomposition and the mixture with animal remains prevented any conclusive identification at the time. The final report, written by Sheriff Merritt, ends with a dry sentence. It was not possible to confirm the fate of all those who disappeared. We believe that many will never be found. But almost contrary to this formal tone, a marginal note, written in pencil and unsigned, appears in one of the case files. If what I saw in the room of repentance was the end of the road for some of them, it was not a quick end. It was a silent end. The village was never the same again. The Ashenford Sisters' house was officially sealed in early 1882. Doors and windows were reinforced with boards. Access to the room of repentance was blocked with iron bars, and it was forbidden to enter without the express permission of the authorities. Even so, there are reports of young people who, years later, tried to break in, searching for evidence, courage, or just stories to tell. No recorded, unofficial incursion found anything but dust, the smell of mold, and the same overwhelming silence. The big revelation, however, did not come from a confession, nor from definitive evidence hidden under the floorboards. It came from time. Decades later, when the investigation was reopened out of historical curiosity, rather than any expectation of justice, researchers gained access to Miriam's notebook and other fragments of correspondence stored in forgotten boxes at the county headquarters. Among billing letters, official correspondence, and loose notes, they found 2 documents that shed new light, albeit incomplete, on the case. The first was a letter never sent, written by Helena to an old acquaintance, in which she said, "The men who pass through here believe they are always leaving, that they can go whenever they want. Perhaps someone needs to remind them that some steps come at a price, that some doors, when they close, do not open onto the same world outside." The second was a draft note, possibly from Miriam, with only 2 sentences. "We didn't want them to disappear. We wanted them to come back different, but some were unwilling to look inside, even with the door locked." These lines, added to the existence of the prepared room, the stored objects, and the marks on the floor, make up the most accepted version among scholars today, that the Ashenford sisters transformed the old guest room into a space of confinement, convinced that they were imposing reflection, repentance, perhaps even a distorted kind of redemption. However, in a world without supervision, clear boundaries, or witnesses, this attempt became something closer to a secret prison than any form of justice. Whether the 28 missing persons mentioned in the archives all passed through that room, we will never know for sure. Some clues point in that direction, others are lost in the distance between villages, in storms, on unmarked trails. What remains, however, is the feeling that inside that house, reality and perception became so intertwined that no one, not the sisters nor the men who crossed its threshold, could say exactly when moral correction ended and when disappearance began. It is this blurred line that makes the Ashenford case so disturbing to this day, and that is also why, decades later, when the official seal was broken for the last time for a final inventory, one of the researchers noted, upon entering the hallway leading to the room of repentance, "It doesn't matter how many years the house has been empty, The silence here still feels occupied. Decades have passed since the Ashenford Sisters' house was finally abandoned by the county. The wood has blackened, the roof has caved in places, and the road that led there has become a corridor of tall grass, where only the wind seems to be allowed to pass. The oldest residents who remained no longer spoke clearly about the case, some because they had forgotten the details, others because they preferred to leave the memory resting in a corner of their minds that required no explanation. It was in this state of half-life that I first encountered the Ashenford file. It was stored on the top shelf of the Hollowridge County Historical Records room, wrapped in old tape and marked with a nearly faded stamp. I wasn't exactly looking for it. I came across it by chance, researching another family, another era. But when I saw the name Ashenford written on the spine, something in the silence around me seemed to shift. The file seemed to be waiting to be opened. What I found inside was not a linear narrative. There was no beginning, middle, or end. There were fragments, official notes, contradictory statements, letters never sent, incomplete reports, hand-altered maps, torn notes, and Miriam's little notebook. It was as if the entire history of the sisters had been left there with the same intention that had shaped the room of repentance itself. To force whoever opened those pages to look long and hard at things they did not want to see. I spent months reading everything, cross-referencing dates, retracing routes, comparing words. Little by little, an image began to form. Not the image of monsters, nor of heroines, but of two women caught in a time too narrow for their loneliness, pressured by circumstances they themselves did not fully understand. The further I went, the more I realized that the mystery was never just about the disappearances. The mystery lay in the gap between what the sisters believed to be fair and what actually happened inside that house, between intention and outcome, between the silence of those who entered and the silence of those who never left. As I reconstructed the chronology, I realized that the community also carried its own share of shadow. Many testimonies, especially the older ones, did not seem to be motivated by humanitarian concern, but by moral discomfort. There were men in the village who feared being associated with the disappeared, women who feared admitting that they knew more than they said, and authorities who preferred to classify the case as unsolved rather than face the implications of everything that had been found in the room of repentance. Still, over the years, some researchers revisited the house, always with formal authorization for sporadic inspections. I myself participated in the last one at the end of my investigation. The path to the top of the hill was overgrown with weeds, and the fence that once outlined the property barely existed. Upon arrival, I noticed that the side door remained locked by the same boards placed there in 1882, but the narrow window of the room, even covered with dust and cobwebs, was still there, leaning over the dim morning light. We entered through the front door, which had been broken into years earlier by vandals. The smell was of damp wood, stagnant time, and long absence. The hallway seemed smaller than the reports had led us to believe, but the feeling, the same one recorded in so many testimonies, remained. The air seemed denser, as if it carried ancient intentions. When we arrived at the door of the room of repentance, there was a brief silence among us all. It wasn't fear, it was respect. It was the recognition that this room, even empty, held something that couldn't be captured in inventories alone. We pushed the door open slowly. The interior was almost as described in the oldest reports. The makeshift bed had been removed by the authorities decades ago, but rectangular marks still existed on the floor, indicating where it had been. The walls remained dark, and the hook near the window was still attached, untouched by time. What impressed me most, however, was not the space itself, but the absence of definitive explanations. The room offered no answers. It only reinforced the same questions that had been echoing since 1881. Who exactly had been there? How long had they stayed? What really happened on those nights when the light from the lamp was still visible from the road? I left the house with more questions than when I entered, but strangely, I didn't feel frustrated. I felt a kind of melancholic understanding, as if the Ashenford case was less about finding answers and more about accepting that certain human stories are made up of gaps that are impossible to fill. When I closed the file for the last time, years later, I had the impression that everything we know about the Ashenford Sisters fits into a brief sentence, hidden in an unsent letter, written by someone who clearly did not intend it to be read. We didn't want to disappear anyone. We just wanted someone to finally listen to us. To this day, no one knows for sure if they were ever heard, or if, in the end, they were just two more voices that faded into the same silence they tried to impose on others. And that's why, whenever I mentally return to that narrow window in the room of repentance, I remember the comment made by one of the oldest researchers as we collected our notes on our last official visit to the house. Time doesn't erase everything. Some absences continue to occupy space, and after so many years of study, I've come to a simple conclusion, perhaps the only one possible given what remains. The true mystery of the Ashenford Sisters lies not in what was found inside the house, but in what we were never able to find outside it. And it is in that silence that the story ends.